start with values, then introduce the threat and problem, challenge you're trying to solve, and then your solution. And now we really have to think, as Kristen said, about tone. How do you push out your threat and challenge without feeding more fear and panic? How do you pivot more than we ever have to spending more time talking about the solutions, so feeding resilience? And that nuance has really shifted from our old, like, you gotta motivate them, get them off the couch with the urgency. We have to be really careful about how much we feed into people's panic. So our new operating instructions follow, and kind of this is my analogy of the month of March at Resource Media. And given that some of our advice feels like it's changed by the hour based on what news alert has come on our phone, I'm really just going to focus on some of the stuff that I feel is more evergreen, not just for the next few weeks, but all the way through the summer. I think that may be most useful. So this is from my inbox yesterday morning. You guys can tell I'm a fan of national marine sanctuaries, but I've seen this from a lot of Global Washington members, that you pushed emails out right away telling your members what you're doing, effective immediately. So you would have said, some of the emails I saw were, our staff are all working from home, we're canceling this event. That was last week's topic. A lot of you amplified the CDC guidance, some of you the local King County Public Health. Those of you who did not do that may now be saying, should we do that? Should we do that right now? And my counsel from today going forward is that the news that you're working from home is really only relevant to people, because they may have received 5 of those emails already, if you get a lot of foot traffic into your office. Those of you who have not yet gotten state orders in your states, if you're like us, you don't have foot traffic showing up in your lobby, you don't need to send an email like that out. But we got an email from Communities for a Better Environment, an environmental justice group in Southern California, that pushed one out to tell people they were working from home because they knew, as an under-resourced organization, there would be a delay in responding to people. So they needed to know that. So I'm going to just go back here. I want to talk about tone for your supporter communications. And that is that I'm not going to say stop communicating to your members. Some of us have to communicate even more. So it's more changing your tone and understanding, which we all do. People are worried. They're worried about their mortgage payments or their rent. They're worried about their own health, their family's health. And so we have this phrase, we've always had it at Resource Media, which is meet people where they are. Don't stop communicating, but you may want to, for example, if you're using humor, kind of road test that. Is that gonna land well with people? But I will say for the media, the answer is some of you may need to stop communicating to the media. It's more about timing and less about tone. And I'm going to go through a couple criteria for what you should go to the media with today. But I want to start with the reality. So one reporter Teresa and I work with is at Wired Magazine, and they told us last week that 90% of their coverage right now is COVID related. And the figures I've heard from other reporters I've talked to is it's 80 to 90% of their coverage. And they know, because they're online, they're just not getting clicks on anything else. So one criteria is, if you really want the media to cover your issue and you think they're going to cover it, but it's not coronavirus related, you still might want to wait, because nobody's going to click on it. And you may want to wait till you get more attention. But last week, one NPR reporter I talked to said, for him to cover it, there has to be a logical connection. He is not assigned to do anything like a good news story. And he gave me this example. He said, the only story somebody in the region's NPR network was assigned that day was this news that our lieutenant governor was joining a Jesuit mission. And they considered that okay to be non-COVID news, because you can do the math here. If we get a different president next year, Governor Inslee may get appointed to a cabinet. The lieutenant governor will be our next governor. That's big news. But he said the bar for your breaking news, your policy milestones, is so much higher. And when I looked for this article that he pointed, I think I scrolled a mile through the Seattle Times homepage till I found this article, and everything above it was 1,600 meters of COVID related news. So I'm going to talk about, though, this window, and I'm going to kick it over to Teresa. The one exception that this reporter said was that his editor at NPR said, we are going to insert one positive news story per newscast. One, not two, one. And our colleague at in our Las Vegas office gave us this advice. He said, I just got a non-COVID story on Las Vegas TV. And we said, how did you do it? And he said that he did not want to appear tone deaf. And so he said to the reporter, I know your entire newscast is coronavirus related. I have also saw yesterday you had one non-coronavirus story. If you are interested in looking at that story, a non-coronavirus story, here's my idea for you. And that shows that he knows they're not looking for other stories, and he knows what they're doing, and it's not like he's tone deaf and clueless. I want to say a shout out to Joy Portella, who had a blog that Global Washington ran last week, reposted, and she called it ambulance chasing, that if you create a false contrived connection to COVID related news in getting your news out, people can see right through it, and it's kind of ambulance chasing. So I want to show an example of what you can do. And this is Water First. You can go to, if you're not on their email list, this came through my email, you can go to their website today, and you'll see this same issue framing, where maybe a couple months ago you would have seen framing about end the walk for water, for clean water sources for girls, for women, a way to alleviate poverty. They have reframed it in the context that people understand right now, which is, we've all been hearing, wash your hands, wash your hands. And they are showing how their solution will save lives and will allow people the ability to wash their hands in places like Bangladesh, pictured here. And I think it does a beautiful job of making such a clear connection while addressing where our heads are right now here in the US, their audience. So that is great. And if you do not have a solution that you can logically connect in your work to coronavirus, I want to flag some other ways that you can still be sending content out to your supporters that resonates with them right now. And that is heroes. What we've seen people really just respond super positively via email open rates and social media is if you have a hero in your story. In times like these, we want heroes in our midst. There's a market. There's a market for hero. It could be your supporters. It could be someone in the field, experts in particular. You know, I'm showing a health professional here, and if you've got health professionals, we all want to give them applause, and I would put them forward in your story. They have the absolute highest credibility and respect among people. But the interesting thing is that a year ago, Teresa and I might have been counseling public health clients to say, you know, this expert culture that we had, like think back to the 90s, it's not there. So many people get medical advice from their peers, their friends. They're not, doctors aren't as trusted anymore. Trust in health professionals is sky high right now. The good news for you all, nonprofits, foundations who are on this webinar, is you've also climbed the charts in terms of people's trust, looking at polling earlier this week in doing right by all of us during this pandemic. So the other thing that I mentioned really at the beginning of the hour, when I talked about, are you feeding fear and panic, or are you feeding resilience, is that the time, I would say, is wrong, underscored, for discussing problems completely unrelated to the current pandemic. But it is oh so right to talk about relevant solutions, and whether it's media relations, you know, reporters who are on the COVID beat, they want a new angle every day. And so I pulled up this email that I got in my inbox. So this is the organization Global to Local. Some of you may know them. They're based in South King County. And this is an email that they sent out to their reporters that I thought and I messaged Teresa, I said, they could make this a news story if they want to be in the local news. And news reporters are looking for how local groups, you can be a corporation, you can be a nonprofit, volunteers, how are you helping the current crisis? That's what they're trying to do, is not just have doom and gloom, sky is falling coronavirus related coverage, but they want to show positive news about how the community is helping out. If all your work is overseas, you still may have local staff who are volunteering, and that's great. But frankly, if you're Puget Sound based, and I'm just speaking for Washington, but any of you around the country, if you're helping people around the globe related to COVID, that's a great positive story. So I want to talk, people are filtering out some news right now. I've talked about that. We're also filtering out some words. People are not in the space right now to be fighting anything other than the crisis immediately before them. So my counsel really, when I'm looking at people's content before they're pushing it out, is, are you reducing war associated language that feeds fear? Even if it's on a subconscious level, offer up nurturing language instead. So many of you who work in crisis zones know that that me first protective instinct takes over in emergency situations. Here, I think you're noticing, if it's not in your own communications, you're noticing it all around this values that's really surfacing of community, collective action. We're in this together, and really ride that wave of communal feeling and feed it as well. The last set of words I want to talk about is the World Health Organization has a guide. You can find it online with more do's and don'ts when talking about coronavirus. And one of the key things is using people first language. That's avoiding defining people by the disease, so COVID-19 victims, or dehumanizing them, calling people cases. So leading with is people who have, a woman who has. So let's talk about Resource Media's mistakes. What are the lessons we have learned? It's the shame and humiliation time. So I have a small team of us who work on public lands conservation. And let's see, time is this would have been 8 or 9 days ago, last Wednesday, that you may remember the National Park Service said it was waiving park entrance fees. And Governor Inslee as well said, go outdoors, go into nature. We had that beautiful stretch of weather, and it was this idea that it would be calming, it would be restorative. So we counseled our clients to say, share your favorite parks, focus on values of health and family and going outside. Well, the weekend passed. So this was Thursday, Friday. We were pushing these messages out. And on Monday, I got this email from one of my partners going, this weekend was a nightmare. And her husband was a park ranger at Olympic National Park. And he had so many visitors. The parking lots were overrun, people breathing all over him. He's in a 14-day quarantine. He's convinced he may have been exposed to COVID. It stressed the local infrastructure. Kids were saying from the community, did the social media campaign, please go home because many of you may know the Olympic Peninsula, there's not an ICU bed in sight for most people. And he even said people were stealing the toilet paper out of the park bathrooms. So on Monday, we had to pivot very quickly and reach out to all our clients and say, do not tell people to go out to their nearest park. You can watch birds from your home window. So really being nimble and constantly monitoring the reaction to what you're putting out is really to state the obvious. I'm going to turn it over to Teresa now because she's going to talk about another instance of pivot and adaptation from one of her Global Foundation clients. So Teresa, you'll want to go off mute.
I'll go off mute now. Thank you, guys. So I want to just give an example that is an example of sometimes we have plans that have been set in motion for months, and they're big plans. And we now have to see how things are unfolding and pivot quickly. So one of our clients is a global foundation who for about a year has planned to make a big announcement right about now. Big global announcement, all sorts of media pitching, all sorts of hoopla. And over the past month, as we've been seeing things unfold, we began saying, maybe we shouldn't be pitching this right now. Maybe we need to be, doing maybe a smaller pitch. Maybe we need to hold on this. Maybe we should do some other things. And then my instinct began to be, we probably shouldn't. And the reason we shouldn't be is all of the reasons that Liz gave above, but also right now there's reputational risk for people who are blindly going out and saying it's all about us and what we're doing and we're so happy. There's reputational risk of looking just so clueless and so out of touch. And also stealing kind of the airspace from the public health communications that needs to be amplified even more, because we see people aren't understanding, or the messages aren't so clear. So we need to be boosting those things. So we saw this tweet, a colleague of mine found this tweet, and I shared it with our client, and they ran it all the way up to the CEO's office and said, this is the media environment we're in. This is a reputational risk to continue on, even though so much money has been invested, so many plans have been baked in. We were hoping just to squeeze it in, even if it was squeeze it in. And thankfully, they totally understood, the senior leadership, and decided to allocate funding to do some sponsored pieces, do some ads and stuff, and just completely take pitching off the table, unless it came in, through kind of some regional outlets. And so I just wanted to give you an example of how sometimes it's incredibly hard, especially to kind of run it up to all of the levels in an organization where it's been planned. It's really important to so-and-so and such in whatever country to explain right now there is reputational risk for going out and seeming really tone deaf. Thank you, Liz, and look forward to answering questions towards the end about just your own situations.
Awesome. Thank you, Teresa. So we're all stuck at home. I'm on social media a lot. I'm on Instagram, and I think people are looking for connection. I had mentioned there had been at the very beginning, I was going to tell you about some of the seismic shifts in both what people are responding to content-wise and whatnot, and I'll talk about that now in terms of your social media. For many people, for getting news, traditional media is where it's at now. And the consumer polling I looked at yesterday is consumer, I shouldn't say consumer, public polling that I looked at yesterday, millennials really stood out for me that they are no longer getting their news from friends. They are turning in droves directly going to news sites, not to social media for their news. And the numbers were as far as I was concerned, they were very jaw-dropping that they're turning their backs on their social feeds. That said, that's just for hard news about the epidemic. They are still responding in droves, and some of you may have these experiences to your social media content, but people are looking for positive content when they go to social media. It is a relief from the news. They're not responding well to anything that's in more of the alarmist content. And within Resource Media on our Slack channels, somebody also shared this article that with TV shows, movies, entertainment, people are going to old stuff like reruns, really familiar content. They're not going for the new edgy stuff. It's almost like social media, entertainment that's not work related is comfort food for us right now. And so my advice is, I know there's a number of development directors who are signed up on this webinar. And you know, your job number one is to foster those connections with your donors. So now more than ever, you know, we may be headed into a recession, is knowing your donors are going to drop you. They drop nonprofits when they no longer feel a connection to them. So if social media is comfort, it's where people are looking for connection, that can be a really tremendous way to kind of think about what you're pushing out there. So we have this example from PATH. This is their work in Vietnam. And a lot of what I've heard from clients who have calls to action, they request a lot from their supporters. Call Congress for this bill, call whoever to allocate new funding streams, is that the sentiment is that people want, instead of feeling helpless, they want to feel helpful. And so I see these where people like PATH are showing, this is the work we're doing right now to address the crisis. Others are pushing out call to action, send this, email that, and they're getting really high response rates now. So test that out with your own issues, see how that works. Another really good strategy is, everybody knows the nation's doctor today now, is that because there is such a pivot towards experts, you know, people who are known, credible, and trusted, and we have a celebrity culture, if your organization has people, either health professionals or you're connected to celebrity spokespeople, really with your social media, live feeds, live streams, whatever you want to do, tap into people's desire to get direction and certainty. The other thing I've been watching a lot across all of our issues is that there's so many partners of ours who don't have that direct connection to solutions around the pandemic. And what they're doing is, and this one is, they're representing grocery workers, obviously. One of our colleagues used to work with the unions, but I've seen this with other organizations even this morning, where they're just putting out a thank you. We know this from the summer with the wildfires, where everybody in certain communities in Washington had the thank you firefighters. take the time. This is my last suggestion of what we've seen resonate really well in communications is to thank the people on the front lines, whether it is of benefit to your organization or not. This is just circling back to the very advice around setting the right tone or being tone deaf. This is going to be received very well. So I started with a quote, and I want to close with a quote from Mr. Rogers. This is a quote I saw last year, and I saved it for this. I don't know when I'm going to need this. I'm going to save it somewhere. And boy, did I need it a couple weeks ago when my own just what's going to happen. So when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And I think we in the Global Washington community in some ways are Mr. Rogers' mom, and we can serve as that beacon of hope for our supporters, for the public. We can be that place of comfort and positivity in our communications to the world outside our doors. So I want to close on that up note and turn it back to Kristen now.
That's so great. Thanks, Liz. That was a perfect quote to end. I do think this community, it can provide some of that uplifting messages of solutions. So, so now is the time for the participants to type in their questions in the Q&A. And I will start with one that I have heard from my colleagues. Liz, you mentioned your advice right now is probably going to be good through the summer, but you're seeing now that some news outlets are saying we're going to do one positive story that's not related to COVID. I mean, how long do we have to relate our stories to COVID? And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, is there a time that you feel like people, either the media or our constituents, that they're going to feel overwhelmed and want new media? I mean, is that months from now? Is that a couple of weeks from now? You know, and maybe it's not a news outlet, but maybe just our constituents or our donors. When do you think people will want to hear a story that's not related to COVID?
Gosh, this is going to sound generic. I think it's honestly, it's when the crisis has ebbed. As long as there's a crisis, that's what people are going to click on. As long as people are feeling like they're in survival, just get by mode. But I do think, Kristen and everybody on the webinar, that when you start to see more of that feature-y coverage, that is a direct sign that whether it's the Seattle Times, the Washington Post, whoever, you know, TV, online, when they start to get more clicks on non-COVID stories, they're going to start publishing more, because that's really such a big driver in their content programming decisions. So it's almost like when you see the first crocuses or the daffodils emerge, you know spring is coming. We'll see it in the news coverage probably a couple of days before I say, okay, I'm feeling like the tide has turned. So you'll be able to see it.
If I could also just add to Liz's comments on there, because we're working in the global environment. Also, you know, when the acute crisis is ebbing here, we might be seeing an upswing of the crisis in other countries, especially places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia is already kind of in the midst. So it is something that we will need to be also attuned to, where the crisis is moving and how it's evolving globally, and adjusting course that way as well. Because sometimes, you know, in some of the countries where we work, we may be actually drawing attention to COVID when COVID's kind of old news here, because it's becoming actually a big problem in other places.
Yeah, and Teresa, can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm starting to see that in the news about Syria, about vulnerable populations in Africa. How should our nonprofits relate to that? Again, how personal do you get? How personal do you say, we in Seattle have felt this directly, and you might know someone directly. Now you have to think about this in Africa. Is that a good message, or is that just too much for people to think about?
You know, that's a really good question, because we do, you know, see compassion fatigue, and we saw that in the HIV/AIDS crisis, where people are just exhausted hearing about Africa suffering and what have you. And so I think it's a little too early to tell. We can begin flagging, like now that we see, and one interesting thing is a couple of years ago when Trump tried to, you know, really slash foreign aid funding, and the global community came out and used global health and security as a reason not to slash it. And so the global kind of community knew that was going to be really strong up against Trump. And, you know, I don't think it was slashed as much as it was proposed to be, but it was a key argument. And so it is something that we can use as a connective tissue of, like, now we see, you know, how slashing foreign aid has fared for us. And we also see what it's like to be in the eye of the storm. And we haven't been, you know, really at, you know, in something major like Ebola or some other things. And so it might help connect people, but also drawing, you know, we've seen, you know, a world-class country like United States. I mean, I'm not going to say we have a world-class health system, but it's, you know, it's pretty darn good in comparison to some other parts of the world. And so we can begin to say, what will happen when you have some of the weakest health systems in the world? How will this unfold? How will that disrupt our operations and what we're doing? And what do we need now? What do we need from our donors, our supporters, what have you now, to make sure we can safeguard some, you know, some of the communities that could be hit even harder? And there aren't ICU units, there aren't ventilators. I mean, I know we have challenges here in the US, but it's a whole different ballgame. And so that is something we can begin to start talking about in relation to our deep connection. Over, you know, years and years working in the global sector, we've had a hard time connecting. I'm in Seattle, something's going on far away, I'm trying to make that connection. It's really hard for people to identify with people who live in vastly different cultures and situations. But this has really kind of shortened the distance in a way.
That's great. I have another question, but I want to make sure the participants that are on, if you have questions, please type it in the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that Q&A button and type in your question there, and I'll ask it. But Teresa and Liz, this is kind of continuing along that. We've heard that there's been, well, the question is, do you think that this pandemic might cause more isolationism, and the idea that we need to take care of our own? There's been some rhetoric that has been fueling that, in terms of it, this came from China, and there's been discrimination against Chinese Americans. So do you think there's a danger in some of the rhetoric out there that people are going to turn more internal and not care about people in developing countries?
I can jump in, Liz. I think that this rhetoric has been here for a couple of years. Yes, we're going to see a sharp increase probably in the visibility of some of this. It is still a small pool of people, and I think that many of our supporters, and just Seattle and Washington being a very globally minded place, lots of global trade, you know, we have a lot of people who are going to be on our side, and our messages will resonate. Yes, there are some, and this will probably increase a little bit, but I think there are enough people that we have on our side, and if we use the right messaging, you know, I don't see it as a huge threat to this sector. But, you know, federal funding and other things, I think we have to be very vigilant on that side.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is where our role, our raison d'etre, comes into play. That's happening. What's our job? Our job is to counter negative spin like that. And our job is to, whether that's happening or not, to be pushing out messages that bring our local community and our global community together and make those connections. Makes it even more important that we are pushing we messaging, not me first messaging out there.
Great. Okay, we have a question coming in from the audience that says, if you could talk about a strategy to break through the media noise right now to appeal to donors, and wondering if the donors are just too bogged down with information right now.
Yeah, I and Teresa, definitely jump in here. I often think of donor communications in terms of what emotion do you have to push, or maybe push is not the right word, to tap in your audiences. And a lot of you on the development side of the house already have internalized it. You know exactly what is the motivating emotion for your donors. Some of our partners who work in racial justice know that emotion they have to tap that works the best is tapping anger. The bulk of our partners, it is tapping a positive emotion. I'd mentioned public lands. Inslee was really pushing that. And public lands donors, for example, you're tapping the emotions of awe and joy around the splendor of a natural environment. With health clients, you're really tapping into empathy and caring and nurturing messages. And Teresa, you can speak even better on the global health side, because I've just seen a lot of global health clients. You saw this with the Water First image, that just the joy in the face of the girls washing their hands. Think about those, and if that emotion is still working for you right now, don't feel like you have to change it. You know what emotion you need to tap in your donors to get them to give.
And the only other thing I would add to that is, just put yourself in the shoes of your donors. If they're of a certain age, their retirement funds may have been slashed dramatically. They may have family or friends who are suffering from this. So another thing you can do is reach out, send personal messages, ask them how they're doing. So really make it more of a relational, just checking in, maybe share a nice story, but ask people to share with you how things are going. So you're kind of setting aside business as usual and focusing on what they might need from you.
That's great. That's really good advice. And we've seen that in some of our Global Washington members that they have been reaching a lot out to donors in that way. Here's another question that's come in. It says, how do you suggest keeping your social media feeds alive with evergreen content without sounding tone deaf?
I think I can handle that one. I think that is a tricky one right now. And one thing you might do is just paste a couple feel-good stories, but recognize the context in which you're sending those. But also maybe let your followers know on social media that you're planning to do some signal boosting. And by signal boosting, that means sharing important information from local health providers and what have you, and say, we are using our own megaphone to share critical information with you, for you to share as just being part of this global community here in Washington. And then when you do share something that is maybe a feel-good story or something, just acknowledge, for those who need just a little breather, or, getting tired of, rewatching, the same Netflix show, here's something that might catch your interest. So just like Liz said, meet them where they are, acknowledge that, they might not be in the right headspace, but here you're offering this up.
Yeah, there's I'm thinking now, Teresa, of an organization working globally that we've supported. Their whole part of their brand is the science-based decision making, and they really have emphasized that over the years as what makes them special. So they took just that idea of evidence-based policy making, science-based decision making, and that is their connection to the current pandemic, even though they do zero work related to this. And so they've said for our evergreen content, we're going to just be pushing out they started at the very beginning with the flattening the curve, sharing that out, saying we're working from home because we believe in science and this is what we can do. But that theme keeps showing up every day. I see it, is that they are trying to use this moment in time on their social media to shift, essentially shifting their own narrative. Science in their realm has been underinvested over the last 3 years. Science in decision making has been sidelined over the last 3 years. And so they're using this time to say, your case in point here is the pandemic, and this is why we invest in science. This is why this is so important. And then they're doing that light connection where appropriate to their issues. So it's just a real nuanced change to their evergreen content to hit just a theme so relevant.
That's great. I'm wondering too, do you have an example of, I mean, maybe you can just think of a scenario, it doesn't have to be a real nonprofit that did this, but a message that failed. You talked about, you and George Bertella talking about the ambulance chasing, about, if it's not natural to really relate your work to COVID, you might want to pause right now. I mean, is there an example, if it's, I don't know, animal conservation, is there an example you can give that it just doesn't work and it doesn't?
I'm not going to name names, but I've seen several come across where it's just pretending like nothing else is happening. And it's just like, look at where we're doing this great thing. And it might be okay, but I think the lack of acknowledgement of people's headspace, especially if they're in Washington or New York City, wherever your constituents are, you could be, in New York City in about a week's time is going to be very intense. It's already intense now. And just imagine if you're a donor and you're sitting in New York and you're getting this, social media post. So I think we just need to be hyper vigilant on how we're really the tone, as Liz noted on some of this, and not pretending like nothing has shifted around us. We are doing this great work. We're going to continue doing this great work. And we're going to highlight this. We're going to highlight that, without acknowledging the headspace that people are in right now, which is threatened, scared, nervous, exhausted. So at the same time, what is interesting is that some of our colleagues who work on energy they work on clean energy transition and all sorts of stuff, they have not seen a dip in just their engagement on social media on those things. So people are, I think, looking for other stuff to focus on. You just want to make sure you have the tone right, because we don't know, where people are when they're opening your email or looking at social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think every single Global Washington member, your most valuable currency always has been, still will be, it is trust. People's trust in you. And I think we all know from looking at the TV news that trust, transparency, and honesty are highly valued commodities right now. And I think maybe that can be your question of, does this fly or should this die content-wise? Does this reinforce people's trust in us, or does it erode their trust in us? And in terms of what Teresa says, that may mean in that case that we get it or not.
Right. So. It's good. Another question, and this is specific for global health NGOs in particular that are working in developing countries that are starting to maybe even see this. Is the U.S. public ready for those stories about COVID hitting developing countries? Are they ready to pivot to what will happen with the healthcare systems and sanitation and hand washing issues in developing countries?
my instinct is yes. I mean, we can be thoughtful in how we roll that out and not be like red light crisis, but just say, hey, we're seeing how hard that, just imagine how this might roll out and what we can do to prevent catastrophe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if your members have already demonstrated, well, not if, but your members have already demonstrated care for people overseas because they're your members, I wouldn't expect stratospheric growth in your followers or membership. All of a sudden, these people becoming global citizens, but your supporters, your followers already have that mindset.
That's great. Good. I mean, the other question, again, I mentioned this earlier, but and Teresa, you talked about this. If there's a campaign that you have to hit pause on, does it work to come back in a few months? I mean, there's so many things that our members do that are timely, even World Water Day, right? That's once a year, it's passed. Is there a way to repackage things so that it's more relevant in a couple months from now, or should we just move on and think about what's going to happen in a few months?
Yeah, I mean, I thought what people did with World TB Day was relevant. So it was kind of linking, how we can track this and what that means for COVID. And so that was a nice, it was a nice hook to an existing thing and reminding people, wow, we battle TB on a daily basis in many places and there's some similarities there. So what can we learn? So that, I thought that was a great example. So some of the bigger things though, yeah, you might bump it, you might rethink it, you might scale it back a little bit. I think the more you can kind of create an evidence base, if you have leadership that have certain expectations to explain why, and just the science of how people process information and emotions and what have you, you can make a good case, or just scale it back and link it if there's a natural link.
Yeah. And, if you can delay that decision, if that's possible, given how much things have changed week by week, you're going to have a very different answer 2 months from now than anything you would give your boss today about that event. And I just think big picture, Teresa and I do so much work, communications planning, developing communications plan, everybody's crisis management plan, very useful if you had one. We're in the crisis management stage, but over the long term, you are going to have to revisit your communications plan because, I think especially if we hit worst case scenarios, we all are going to come out the other side having to present a new case for support because the world will be different and it may not go back to how it was in 2019 ever. And so in some ways you have to have an event or something where you present who you are, how you're going to make a difference in the world going forward in World 2.0. That's in the worst case scenario if we don't miraculously bounce back. And every one of us will need that reintroduction to our donors as we come out the other side of why we are relevant, why we are even more relevant today than we were in 2019.
That's great. Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that everyone on this call knows that Liz and Teresa have offered to make this PowerPoint available to you all. So we can email that out since you've registered for this. And as a reminder, Global Washington is scheduling these type of webinars, and hopefully they'll be every Friday at 10 a.m. So you can put that on your calendar. We'll have a couple that are not on Fridays because we want to front load this information because we know people need some of this now sooner than later. So we're working on one probably that's going to be next Tuesday or Wednesday. So keep that in mind. And again, if you have questions that come up for Resource Media, Liz and Teresa, their emails are listed there on the screen right now. You can always contact Pratima that you registered with at Global Washington. and we can put you in touch with Liz and Teresa as well. But Liz and Teresa, do you have some final words of inspiration for this group as we're in uncharted territory?
We are in uncharted territory.
So
Teresa.
Yeah, I'll just start with just a personal connection. So we have found, and a lot of us, we deal in person. We have events together. We have meetings with funders or donors or what have you. And so something is lost when we're not seeing each other in person. But we have noted that now that we're all working from home, we've got the kids and the puppies and people can see our lives. There has been something beautiful in just, I've been on the phone with folks in New York City and they're like, what's going on? Are you home with, and so that is nice. So just, I encourage folks to keep up those personal connections, and we're all kind of living through it together. And yes, please shoot us an email if you have questions or just want to say hi or whatever. We'd love to chat with you.
Yeah. Thank you as well. And echoing Teresa, it's all about relationships and human connection now. And that's so apropos to your communications.
That's great. Yeah, there is something to be said about going through this crisis together. We're all experiencing this. Very few people are not affected. So, and it's great to be authentic in your messaging as you connect. So thank you so much, Liz and Teresa, for this presentation. It's fantastic. I think it's exactly what people need right now, and as they're thinking about how to communicate. Thank you all for joining. Again, it's great to have Global Washington members on this and others, so continue to look for our future events. And thanks so much. Stay safe, stay healthy. We wish you well. Thank you all for joining today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.